Welcome to our deep dive into the world of national anthems.
Oh, cool.
We're going to be exploring a recent academic study
Okay.
that analyzed the texts of nearly 200 anthems,
Wow.
looking for hidden patterns and cultural quirks.
Sounds interesting.
Get ready to uncover some fascinating insights
Okay.
about how countries express their identity through music and words.
It's amazing how often we sing along to these anthems
Right.
without really considering their deeper meaning.
Yeah.
We might notice the patriotic themes, but there's so much more beneath the surface.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
This study goes way beyond identifying common themes, like love for country or freedom.
Right.
It uses linguistic analysis software to uncover subtle patterns
Okay.
in language, sentiment, and even grammar, for example.
Yeah.
One of the things that really jumped out at me was the difference in emotional language
Ah.
across regions.
Yeah, you wouldn't necessarily think of this at first.
Right.
But Latin, European, and Germanic anthems tend to use fewer emotional words compared to other regions.
That's surprising.
Really?
I always thought of anthems like those from France or Italy as being full of passion.
That perception might come from the music itself.
Oh, okay.
But when you look at the lyrics,
Right.
the word choices are often more restrained in terms of expressing overt emotion.
So how do we explain this difference?
It might be related to broader cultural tendencies
Okay.
and even some research on how different languages express emotions.
Oh, interesting.
Some languages might have a built-in positive bias,
Okay.
meaning they tend to use more positive words overall.
That's fascinating.
Yeah,
Could you give us an example of what you mean by positive bias in language?
certainly.
Yeah.
Let's take the English language, for example.
Okay.
Studies have shown that even when describing neutral or negative events,
Uh-huh.
English speakers tend to use a higher proportion of positive words
Yeah.
compared to speakers of some other languages. This doesn't necessarily mean they're experiencing things more positively,
Right.
but rather that the structure of the language itself might encourage a more positive framing.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah,
So maybe when we hear Latin European anthems,
right.
the emotional impact comes more from the music than the specific words being used.
That's a very astute observation.
Oh, thanks.
It highlights how music and lyrics work together to create a powerful emotional experience.
The study also looked at pronoun use,
Okay.
and it turns out there are some pretty striking contrasts there too.
Indeed.
Yeah.
One of the most significant findings was the difference between African and Southeast Asian anthems.
Okay.
African anthems heavily emphasize the collective we,
Uh-huh.
reflecting a strong sense of unity and shared identity.
That makes sense given the importance of community in many African cultures. It's
Right.
like the entire nation is speaking as one voice.
Exactly.
But then you look at Southeast Asian anthems,
Yeah.
and it's a completely different story.
Yeah.
They use a lot of I statements.
It's a stark contrast, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it could be linked to the idea of individualism being more prevalent in certain Southeast Asian cultures.
Right.
Of course, it's important to avoid overgeneralizations,
Sure.
as there's a lot of cultural diversity within these regions.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But it's still really interesting to see how these broad cultural patterns
Right.
might be reflected in something as seemingly simple as pronoun choice.
I agree.
Speaking of interesting patterns, the study also found something unique about Balkan anthems.
Okay.
They use you a lot more than others.
That's right. And this particular observation is particularly intriguing because it connects to the region's history.
I'm all ears.
Okay, so the Balkans have a long and complex history of conflict, often defined by struggles against outside forces or neighboring groups.
So when they use you in their anthems, are they speaking to a potential adversary?
That's a plausible interpretation. Think about lines from the Albanian anthem, like, "Here the enemies don't have a place."
Right.
Or how the Romanian anthem directly addresses Romanians as you. There's a directness, almost a confrontational tone that sets them apart from anthems
Yeah.
that focus on more abstract concepts of nationhood.
That's a really interesting perspective.
Yeah.
It's like they're rallying the people and drawing a clear line in the sand.
Yeah.
It's not just about celebrating their own identity.
Right.
It's about defining themselves in relation to others.
Precisely.
And this focus on defining oneself against others might also contribute to another finding from the study.
Okay.
Balkan anthems, on average, tend to score lower on measures of positive sentiment compared to other regions.
Okay. That makes sense given the historical context.
Right.
Yeah.
But before we dive deeper into sentiment analysis, I'm curious about how they actually measured sentiment in the anthems.
Okay.
Isn't that kind of subjective?
That's where the power of linguistic analysis software comes in. They used software that can analyze the overall feeling of a text
Right.
based on the words used, taking into account things like positive and negative connotations.
So it's not just about looking for specific words like happy or sad,
Right. Yeah.
but rather analyzing the overall emotional tone of the language.
Exactly. It's a much more nuanced approach
Got it.
that allows researchers to quantify the sentiment of a text in a way that's more objective
Yeah.
and comparable across different anthems.
Okay.
And the results of this analysis yielded some fascinating surprises.
This is already so fascinating.
Yeah.
I'm eager to hear what they discovered.
Well, one of the most unexpected findings was that Latin European anthems,
Yeah.
which you might assume are full of passion and joy,
Mm-hmm.
actually scored lower on positive sentiment than some other regions.
Really?
Yeah.
That's completely counterintuitive.
It seems that way, doesn't it? But remember, the music itself often conveys a lot of that emotion. What's interesting is that Central and Western Asian, Germanic, and Slavic anthems all scored quite high on positive sentiment.
That's fascinating. Is there any explanation for such a difference in sentiment across regions?
Well, the study explored possible correlations, and one that stood out was a link between positive sentiment in anthems and a country's history of wars, particularly the number of wars they had won.
So are you saying that countries with more military victories tend to have more upbeat anthems?
It's not a direct causal link, of course, but it's a thought-provoking correlation. Perhaps those victories fostered a sense of national pride and optimism that seeped into their anthems. It raises the question, do national narratives of triumph and resilience shape how countries express themselves through these symbolic songs?
It certainly makes you think about the connection between a country's history and its cultural expressions. And speaking of expressions, let's go back to those African anthems we were discussing earlier, the ones with all the we statements. The study also found something interesting about the types of verbs they use.
You're right. African anthems are packed with action verbs, words like fight, build, rise. It's very dynamic and forward-looking.
So it's not just about togetherness, it's about taking collective action, shaping their own destiny.
Precisely. And it contrasts sharply with Central and Western Asian anthems, where verbs describing states of being to be, to have, to exist are more common.
Interesting. Those anthems seem to focus more on enduring, on simply being, rather than actively shaping the future.
That's one way to interpret it. This difference in verb usage might offer insights into how different cultures perceive agency, the ability to act and influence the world around them.
I see. The choice of verbs can actually reveal deeper cultural beliefs about a nation's role in shaping its own fate.
Exactly. And this focus on action versus being isn't the only linguistic fingerprint that emerged from the study. Another fascinating finding was the prevalence of body words across many anthems.
Body words. That sounds a bit strange in the context of national anthems. What exactly do you mean?
Think about the common phrases we hear in anthems: the blood of patriots, the heart of the people, the arms that will defend the nation. These are all examples of using body parts as metaphors to represent the nation itself.
I get it. It's like the nation is being personified as a physical being with its own heart, blood, and limbs.
Yes. It makes the concept of the nation more tangible, more relatable. It also reinforces the idea that the nation isn't just an abstract entity, it's embodied in its people.
That's a powerful way to connect individuals to the idea of a shared national identity. But I'm curious, did the study find any regional variations in the use of body words?
It did. For example, Slavic and Central Western Asian anthems use body words less frequently than other regions.
I wonder if that difference relates to varying cultural ideas about the relationship between the individual and the state.
That's a really insightful question. Perhaps in cultures where the individual is more integrated into the collective, there's less emphasis on the physical body as a symbol of national identity. The focus might shift towards shared history, collective will, or spiritual values.
That makes a lot of sense. It's amazing how these subtle linguistic choices can offer such profound insights into a nation's self-perception and cultural values. It makes me think back to the sentiment analysis we were discussing earlier. I'm curious, did the study look at how the sentiment scores correlated with other social indicators?
They did, and this is where things get even more interesting. They found some unexpected correlations between the overall feeling of a country's anthem and their social attitudes.
So did they find that happier countries tend to have more positive anthems?
Not quite. They actually found a weak correlation between positive sentiment in anthems and more conservative social attitudes, such as those relating to traditional gender roles.
That's surprising. I would have assumed that societies with more progressive views would have anthems that are more optimistic and forward-looking.
It does seem counterintuitive, doesn't it? But that's what the data suggests.
This just goes to show how complex anthems are as cultural products. They're shaped by so many historical and social forces that it's difficult to draw simple conclusions about their meaning and impact.
Absolutely. They might not always reflect the current state of a society, but perhaps they offer a glimpse into a nation's aspirations or even anxieties.
I'm starting to see anthems in a whole new light. They're not just patriotic songs. They're historical documents, cultural artifacts, and even psychological puzzles.
You've hit the nail on the head, and they invite us to think critically about how nations construct their identities and project themselves to the world.
We've covered so much ground already, from emotional language to pronouns, verb choices, sentiment analysis, and the symbolism of the body. It's truly remarkable how much we can learn about a country just by paying attention to the words they use in their anthems.
And we've only just begun to scratch the surface. There's so much more to uncover in this fascinating world of anthems.
Before we get lost in the weaves of linguistic analysis, let's connect this back to our listeners' experience. Listening to an anthem might seem like a passive act, but it's actually a chance to engage with the nation's history, culture, and even psychology.
That's a great point. The next time you hear an anthem playing, don't just tune it out. Pay attention to the words, the tone, the subtle choices the composers made. You might be surprised by what you discover.
And as you listen, ask yourself, what does this anthem tell me about this country? What values are they emphasizing? What story are they trying to tell about themselves?
Because anthems aren't just about music and lyrics, they're about the stories nations tell about themselves. And those stories are often told through specific themes and topics. Remember the study we've been discussing? It found that certain themes are more prominent in some regions than others.
You're right, like how the theme of liberty is so prevalent in Latin American and Germanic anthems.
Exactly. Freedom is a central theme in those anthems, which makes sense given those regions' histories of fighting for independence and individual rights. It's almost like they're proclaiming their hard-won freedom to the world through their anthems.
But what's interesting is that liberty as a theme is almost entirely absent in Asian anthems.
That's a keen observation. It highlights how anthems can reflect a country's unique historical trajectory and cultural values. Perhaps in some Asian cultures, the emphasis is more on harmony order or the collective good rather than individual liberty.
Another theme the study found was religion. It appears frequently in English-language anthems, but much less so in Latin American or Slavic ones.
That's a great example of how anthems can reflect a country's dominant religious beliefs or even the role of religion in their history. Think about the American anthem, for example. The phrase, "God bless America," is practically woven into the fabric of their national identity.
That's true. It reflects the historical significance of religion in the founding and development of the United States.
Precisely. But in other parts of the world, religion might play a less prominent role in public life, and that's reflected in their anthems.
So if we take a step back and consider everything we've discussed today, we can see that anthems aren't just songs, they're windows into a nation's soul. They can reveal a lot about cultural values, historical experiences, and even psychological tendencies.
They invite us to think critically about the stories nations tell about themselves, stories encoded in music and lyrics that have the power to shape our understanding of the world.
Before we wrap up, I have one final thought-provoking question for our listeners to ponder. The study found a surprisingly weak correlation between the overall feeling of a country's anthem and things like social attitudes or happiness levels. What do you think that is?
It's a real head-scratcher, isn't it? Are anthems lagging indicators of cultural shifts, clinging to older values even as society evolves? Or are they aspirational, expressing ideals that a nation is still striving to achieve a vision of what they hope to become?
Yeah, it really makes you think.
It does.
It's almost as if these anthems are whispering secrets, challenging us to decode their hidden meanings.
Yeah.
And uncover the complex relationship between a nation's past, present, and future.
That's a beautiful way to put it. They offer us a glimpse into the soul of a nation.
Right.
A glimpse that's often more nuanced and layered than we might initially realize.
This deep dive has completely changed how I think about national anthems.
Really?
I used to see them as simple patriotic songs, but now I realize there's so much more than that. They're historical echoes, cultural snapshots, and even psychological reflections of a nation's identity.
And they're constantly evolving, too, as societies change and values shift.
Yeah.
So, too, do the ways in which nations express themselves through their anthems.
Okay.
Some cling to tradition, while others embrace new ideas and aspirations.
Which brings us back to that thought-provoking question about the disconnect between anthem sentiment and social indicators.
Yeah.
It really makes you wonder,
Okay.
are anthems lagging behind cultural shifts? Or are they leading the way, setting a tone for the future?
It's a question worth pondering, and I don't think there's a simple answer.
Right.
Perhaps it varies from nation to nation.
Yeah.
Maybe some anthems are like time capsules,
Okay.
preserving a sense of national identity rooted in the past,
Interesting.
while others are more like blueprints outlining a vision for the future.
I love that analogy.
Yeah.
Time capsules versus blueprints.
Right.
It perfectly captures the tension between tradition and progress that's often embedded in these songs.
And that tension is part of what makes them so fascinating to study.
Yeah.
They invite us to consider not only what a nation is,
Right.
but also what it aspires to be.
This has been an incredible journey into the world of national anthems.
It has.
We've explored everything from the emotional weight of words to the symbolism of pronouns and verbs,
Right.
the power of sentiment analysis, and the recurring themes that weave their way through these anthems.
It's fascinating stuff.
To our listeners, I encourage you to continue exploring this fascinating world.
I agree.
The next time you hear a national anthem, listen with fresh ears.
Uh-huh.
Pay attention to the nuances of the language, the emotional undercurrents, and the stories they tell.
I think you'll be surprised at what you find.
And ask yourself, what does this anthem tell me about this country?
Right.
What values are they emphasizing?
Yeah, what story are they trying to tell about themselves?
Because within the notes and words of these anthems lies a rich tapestry of human experience waiting to be uncovered. Happy listening.